subscribe. The 1%, Part 8. The Fire in the Forge. MXDM, aka Pirate 1, or VJ, Tsunami X. April 10th, 2026. Part 8. The Civilizational Bridge. 36. The Fire in the Forge. There is a moment in every major metallurgical tradition when the smith understands that fire is not the enemy of the metal. The uninitiated see the forge's heat as destruction. The application of a force so extreme that the metal loses the form it had, becomes something molten and unstable and dangerous, flows without direction, loses the specific properties that made it useful in the cold state it occupied before the fire reached it. The uninitiated see this and conclude that the fire is the threat, that the metal's integrity requires protection from the heat, that the forge is the place where things are ruined rather than the place where things are made. The smith knows otherwise. The smith knows that the metal's cold state form was not its final form, was the form that the metal arrived in, the form produced by the specific history of pressures and coolings and previous heatings that the metal had undergone before it reached the forge. That form was real. It had specific properties. It was useful for specific purposes. But it was not the form that the current purpose requires. And the only path from the form the metal has to the form the purpose requires passes through the heat that the uninitiated read as destruction. The fire does not destroy the metal. It liberates the metal from the form that was not its final form. And the forge, the specific spatial arrangement of the fire and the anvil and the tools and the smith's specific intelligence, is not the place where the metal is ruined. It is the place where the metal is made into what it needs to become, through the specific combination of heat sufficient to make the change possible and form-giving pressure sufficient to direct the change toward the purpose that the new form must serve. The civilization we are inside is in the forge. This is not a metaphor deployed for rhetorical effect. It is the most precise description available of the specific condition of the current historical moment. The moment in which the cognitive equalization is applying to the specific social forms that industrial civilization produced over 2 centuries of continuous development and refinement, a heat sufficient to make those forms fluid, to liberate them from the specific shape that the scarcity era's conditions required them to hold, and to make possible the new form that the transition civilization's specific purpose requires. The professional class is fluid. The institutions that organized its authority are fluid. The spatial forms that housed its operations are fluid. The governance mechanisms that directed its collective action are fluid. The economic arrangements that sustained its material life are fluid. The social geographies that organized its human relationships are fluid. The identity structures that gave its members the specific self-understanding that the scarcity era's cognitive hierarchy required are fluid. All of this is the fire. The displacement wave is the fire. The legitimacy crisis of institutions is the fire. The dissolution of the cognitive hierarchy is the fire. The end of professional identity is the fire. The collapse of the information asymmetries that made the scarcity era's power arrangement sustainable is the fire. The uninitiated, and the category of the uninitiated includes a significant fraction of the policy makers and the institutional leaders and the cultural commentators who are attempting to understand and respond to the current moment, see this fire, and conclude that the civilization is being destroyed, that the fluidity is the loss of the specific forms that the civilization requires to function, that the urgency is to restore the cold state form, to rebuild the institutions whose legitimacy has been challenged, to restore the employment whose dissolution has produced the displacement, to reestablish the cognitive hierarchy whose dissolution has destabilized the social arrangements it organized. This is the uninitiated's response to the forge, is the response that will fail. Not because restoration is never the right response to change. There are conditions in which the specific form that change has dissolved was the right form, and the restoration of that form is the correct response to its dissolution. But because the cognitive equalization is not a disruption of the scarcity era's forms that leaves the conditions for those forms intact, is not the kind of change that restoration can address. Because the conditions that produce the forms have changed in ways that make the form's restoration impossible even when the will to restore them is present. The information asymmetry that made the cognitive hierarchy's authority legitimate is not temporarily disrupted. It is structurally dissolved by the AI tools that are making sophisticated analysis available to everyone who claims them. And the dissolution is irreversible in the specific sense that no institutional arrangement can recreate the scarcity of analytical capacity that the hierarchy's legitimacy required once the tools that dissolve it are present in the world. The employment that organized the professional class's identity and its daily life is not temporarily reduced by a cyclical economic downturn. It is structurally transformed by the same tools, and the transformation is producing a different relationship between the human and the function, a different configuration of what humans do and what automated systems do, that will not return to the previous configuration regardless of the policy responses that attempt to preserve the previous configuration's specific forms. The institutions whose legitimacy is in crisis are not temporarily challenged by a period of unusually rapid change. They are structurally inadequate to the specific conditions that the cognitive equalization produces, organized for a world of cognitive asymmetry that is becoming a world of cognitive parity, and therefore incapable of performing their legitimating functions in the new conditions without the structural transformation that would make them different institutions rather than the same institutions performing better. The fire is not a disruption of the scarcity era's conditions. It is the dissolution of the scarcity era's conditions. And the correct response to the dissolution of conditions is not the restoration of the forms those conditions produced. It is the formation of the new forms that the new conditions require. That is what the forge is for. The 1% campus is a forge, not the only forge. Every institution and community and governance experiment that is genuinely grappling with the conditions that the cognitive equalization is producing is a forge in the sense that this chapter intends. But the specific forge that this doctrine is building, the specific spatial and institutional arrangement of fire and form-giving pressure and the Smith's intelligence, is the transition campus, where the specific people whom the dissolution has made fluid are received in their fluidity and subjected to the specific form-giving pressures that direct the change toward the new forms that the transition civilization requires. The fire that the campus receives is the fluidity of the displaced, the specific condition of the people who arrive at the campus and the dissolution of the professional identity and the employment and the institutional authority and the social geography that the scarcity era organized their lives around. They arrive fluid, not destroyed, not ruined, but liberated from the specific forms that the scarcity era's conditions require them to hold, and therefore available for the new forms that the transition era's conditions require them to become. The form-giving pressure that the campus applies is the specific combination of the community, the dream validation process, the being surface, the non-hierarchical governance, the cross-class encounter, the temporal rhythms, and the new civic minds formation. The specific elements of the campus's design that give direction to the fluidity, that shape the change toward the specific forms that the transition civilization requires rather than allowing the fluidity to resolve into the default forms that the uninitiated's restoration impulse would impose. The Smith's intelligence that the campus embodies is the doctrine, the specific understanding of what the transition civilization requires and how the forge's specific design produces it, the governing logic that shapes every element of the campus's spatial and institutional architecture toward the new forms that the purpose demands. The forge makes the new forms. But the forge requires fuel, and the fuel is the specific understanding of what is being dissolved and why the dissolution is necessary, and what the new form must be capable of doing that the old form could not. Without this understanding, without the Smith's intelligence, the forge is only heat, and heat without direction produces not new forms, but the formless residue of forms that have been dissolved without being given the pressure that would direct the dissolution toward something new. The doctrine is the Smith's intelligence. It provides the specific understanding of the dissolution, the cognitive equalization the displacement wave, the legitimacy crisis, the end of professional identity, the collapse of the social geography of class. That makes the forge's heat legible as the necessary precondition of a new forms rather than as the threat to the old ones. And it provides a specific understanding of what the new forms must be capable of: the dream validation process, the new civic mind, the post-professional identity, the non-hierarchical authority, the economic substrate without extraction, the being surface, the cross-class solidarity that gives the form-giving pressure its specific direction. There is a dimension of the forge metaphor that the doctrine must extend beyond the conventional reading of the metallurgical image, because the conventional reading stops at the individual smith working the individual piece of metal toward the individual purpose, and the transition civilization's forge is working at a scale that the individual smith cannot encompass. The forge of the civilizational transition is not the work of a single smith with a single piece of metal toward a single purpose. It is the distributed work of thousands of forges, every campus in the network, every governance experiment, every institutional innovation, every new civic mind that the campus's formation environment develops and deploys into the surrounding city's institutional life, each applying its specific form-giving pressure to the specific portion of the dissolution it receives, each contributing to the new forms that the transition civilization requires without any single forge being responsible for the complete new form. The cathedral analogy returns here. The cathedral was not built by a single smith, but by the specific combination of the architect's intelligence, and the mason's craft, and the glassmaker's skill, and the carpenter's precision, and the laborer's strength, each working on the specific portion of the cathedral that their specific competence and their specific position in the construction process made available to them. No single craftsperson could have built the cathedral. The cathedral was built by the specific organization of multiple craft intelligences toward the shared purpose that the architect's intelligence defined. The transition civilization's new forms will not be built by a single doctrine or a single network or a single first campus. They will be built by the specific organization of multiple intelligences, the doctrine's conceptual architecture, the network's institutional development, the campus's spatial and governance design, the new civic mind's distributed deployment, the state's eventual formalization, the cultural vocabulary spread toward the shared purpose that the cognitive equalization's specific conditions require. The 1% doctrine does not claim to be the complete intelligence of the civilizational forge. It claims to be the specific element of that intelligence that defines the purpose, the specific understanding of what the transition civilization requires, and how the first instances of the new forms can be built in the conditions that the current moment presents. Other intelligences are building other elements of the new forms. The political economists who are designing the automation tax and the billionaire levy and the universal basic income are building the economic infrastructure of the transition civilization's material foundation. The urban planners who are redesigning the scarcity city's spatial organization around the post-scarcity city's requirements are building the physical infrastructure of the transition civilization's built environment. The governance theorists who are developing the institutional forms of the non-hierarchical authority structure are building the governance infrastructure of the transition civilization's collective decision-making. The cultural practitioners who are developing the new vocabulary and the new aesthetic forms of the transition civilization are building the cultural infrastructure of the transition civilization's self-understanding. All of these are working the same forge. The 1% doctrine is the specific intelligence that says the forge requires a specific spatial form, the campus, and a specific governance mechanism, the dream validation process, and a specific symbolic anchor, the dream catcher, and a specific funding mechanism, the 1% allocation in private development, and a specific population, the displaced, the former elite, the bourgeoisie in transition, the former worker with intelligence, and a specific sequence, Berkeley as origin, private development as first implementation, network as accumulation mechanism, state as eventual formalizer, post-scarcity city as eventual emergence. The specific form and the specific mechanism and the specific anchor and the specific funding and the specific population and the specific sequence. These are what the doctrine contributes to the forge's operation. They are not the complete forge. They are the specific element without which the forge lacks the spatial and institutional form that the new civic mind's formation requires. There is a final dimension of the forge and the fire that the chapter must address, because it is the dimension that the civilizational moment most acutely presents and that the doctrine's optimism, its genuine belief in the possibility of the new forms, must be held against with the honesty that the moment requires. The forge can fail. The fire that makes the new forms possible is the same fire that makes the destruction possible. The dissolution that liberates the metal from the form that was not its final form is the same dissolution that, if the form-giving pressure is insufficient or misdirected or absent, produces the formless residue rather than the new form. The cognitive equalization that dissolves the cognitive hierarchy's authority is the same dissolution that, if the governance architecture that receives the dissolution is absent, produces the specific political pathologies, the authoritarian consolidation, the scapegoating of convenient minorities, the retreat to the simpler identity structures of nationalism and tribalism and religious fundamentalism that legitimacy vacuums historically produce when they are not received by the governance. Architecture that converts the dissolution into the new forms. The forge fails when the fire's temperature is sufficient to produce the dissolution and the smith's intelligence is absent or inadequate to provide the form-giving pressure that directs the dissolution toward the new form. The civilizational forge of the current moment has the fire. The cognitive equalization is producing the dissolution at the scale and speed that the fire requires, dissolving the cognitive hierarchy, displacing the professional class, challenging the institutional legitimacy, fluidizing the social geography. The fire is present and its temperature is sufficient. What is not yet sufficient is the form-giving pressure, the governance architecture and the spatial infrastructure and the institutional forms that receive the dissolution and direct it toward the new forms that the transition civilization requires. The campus network is in its first instances. The doctrine is in its first publication. The new civic minds are in their first formations. The being surface is in its first spatial expressions. The dream validation process is in its first governance iterations. The form-giving pressure exists. It is not yet at the scale that the fire's temperature requires. This is the specific urgency that the doctrine names at the end of the chapter in which the fire and the forge have been the organizing images. Not the urgency of alarm, not the urgency of crisis that produces the panicked response that makes things worse, but the urgency of the smith who knows that the metal is at the temperature where the form-giving pressure must be applied, and that the window in which the pressure can direct the change toward the new form rather than allowing it to resolve into the default pathologies is specific and limited. The metal is at temperature. The forge must be at work. The campus must be built. The network must grow. The doctrine must be read and understood and carried by the people who will build the next instances. The dream validation process must be working. The new civic minds must be forming. The being surfaces must be receiving the displaced. Not eventually. Now. In the specific window between the fire's current temperature and the solidification that will occur, either into the new forms if the form-giving pressure is applied with sufficient intelligence and sufficient scale, or into the default pathologies if the form-giving pressure is absent or insufficient. The forge is working. The smith's intelligence is present. The metal is at temperature. The form-giving pressure is beginning to be applied. What happens next depends on the speed with which the pressure reaches the scale that the fire's temperature requires. That speed is a human choice, not the choice of a single person or a single institution or a single doctrine. The distributed choice of the full range of people whose specific intelligences and specific competences and specific resources and specific institutional positions make them part of the forge's operation, each applying their specific form-giving pressure to the specific portion of the dissolution they are positioned to receive, each contributing to the new forms that none of them can produce alone. The doctrine names the purpose. The campus embodies the purpose. The network scales the purpose. The new civic minds carry the purpose into the surrounding city. The city accumulates the purpose into the post-scarcity spatial and governance organization that is the purpose's full expression. The fire is the condition. The forge is the response. The new forms are the possibility. The civilization that builds the forge and the fire is the civilization that emerges from the transition, having made something new from the dissolution, having used the heat not to destroy the forms it had, but to liberate them from what they were so that they could become what the new conditions require. The civilization that does not build the forge and the fire is the civilization that the fire consumes, that allows the dissolution to resolve into the default pathologies, because the governance architecture and the spatial infrastructure and the institutional forms that would have received the dissolution were not built in the window that the fire's temperature opened. The window is open. The forge must be built. The first campus is the forge's first instantiation, the specific spatial and institutional form through which the fire's heat is received and the form-giving pressure is applied, and the first new forms are produced from the first portion of the dissolution that the first campus is positioned to receive. It is not enough. It is the beginning. In the beginning, in the specific sense that the smith understands who has worked the forge long enough to know what the beginning of a good piece of work looks like before the final form is visible, but after the heat has made the change possible and the first strokes of the hammer have begun to give it direction. The beginning is everything. Because the beginning is the proof that the forge is working, that the fire is not consuming, that the dissolution is being received and directed and shaped toward the new forms, that the civilization is in the forge, not burning, becoming. 37. Meaning as the new scarcity. Scarcity is not a permanent condition. It is the relationship between a specific resource and the specific demand for that resource in the specific conditions of a specific historical moment. The resource that is scarce in one set of conditions is abundant in another. The firewood that was scarce in the treeless steppe was abundant in the forested valley. The clean water that is scarce in the Sahara is abundant in the Norwegian fjord. The analytical capacity that was scarce in the conditions of the cognitive hierarchy is becoming abundant in the conditions of the cognitive equalization. But scarcity itself, the condition of insufficient supply relative to demand, does not disappear when the specific resource that was scarce becomes abundant. What changes is the specific resource whose scarcity organizes the civilization's allocation decisions, social arrangements, and identity structures. The civilization that found a way to increase the supply of the previously scarce resource does not arrive at the absence of scarcity. It arrives at the next scarcity, the resource whose supply the previous abundance has not increased and whose demand the previous abundance has, in specific cases, intensified. The transition from the scarcity era to the post-scarcity era is therefore not the transition to the absence of scarcity. It is the transition to a different scarcity. The specific resource whose insufficient supply relative to demand will organize the post-scarcity civilization's allocation decisions and social arrangements and identity structures in a way that the cognitive hierarchy's analytical capacity organize the scarcity eras. This is the argument that the chapter title names. Meaning is the new scarcity. Not meaning in the vague sense of the word that motivational speakers and wellness industries deploy, the general affirmation that life should feel significant, that work should feel purposeful, that relationships should feel connected. Meaning in the specific economic and sociological sense that scarcity analysis requires. The resource whose supply is insufficient relative to demand in the specific conditions of the transition civilization, whose allocation is therefore the primary governance challenge of the post-scarcity era, and whose possession is the primary basis of the social differentiation that the post-scarcity civilization will organize itself around. Why is meaning scarce in the specific conditions that the cognitive equalization produces? The scarcity of meaning is the specific consequence of the abundance of intelligence. In the scarcity era, the scarcity of analytical capacity was itself a meaning generator. The person who possessed the rare cognitive resources that the civilization needed experienced her possession of them as the answer to the question of her significance. She mattered because she could do what others could not. The rarity of her capacity was the foundation of her meaning. The specific experiential content that the scarcity of the resource she possessed gave to the question of why she was here and what she was for. The cognitive equalization dissolves this meaning generator. When the analytical capacity that was the foundation of the professional sense of significance is no longer scarce. When anyone who claims the AI tools can produce sophisticated analysis at the level that the professional's years of credential training were required to produce, the possession of that capacity is no longer the answer to the meaning question. The rarity that made the capacity meaningful is gone. The capacity remains, but the specific form of meaning it generated, the meaning of the rare and the necessary, is dissolved with the rarity. This is the meaning crisis at the center of the cognitive equalization's human consequences, not the economic crisis of lost income, which is real and urgent, but the deeper existential crisis of the dissolved meaning generator, the specific loss of the resource whose possession was the foundation of the professional identity's answer to the question of why she was here. The cognitive equalization does not only dissolve the existing meaning generators. It intensifies the demand for meaning in the specific way that every increase in material abundance intensifies the demand for the non-material dimensions of the good life. The history of every successful economic development is the history of the increasing demand for meaning as the material conditions of life improve. The society that is struggling with material scarcity, with insufficient food, shelter, safety, and physical health, is the society in which material provision absorbs the majority of human attention and energy, leaving limited residual capacity for the pursuit of meaning in the fuller sense. The society that has solved the problem of material scarcity, whose members have reliable access to the food, shelter, safety, and physical health that the material foundation of the good life requires, is the society in which the question of meaning becomes the primary organizing challenge of collective and individual life. The cognitive equalization is the most radical and rapid increase in the effective material abundance available to the majority of the world's population since the Industrial Revolution, not because it increases the material goods available, but because it dramatically increases the cognitive capacity available, which is the primary input to the production of material goods and the primary mechanism through which the material goods that are already produced are made accessible to the people who need them. The cognitive equalization that makes sophisticated analysis, planning, argumentation, and knowledge available to everyone who claims the tools is the effective equivalent of the material abundance that the Industrial Revolution made available to the people who were connected to its production systems. An enormous increase in the effective resources available to the people the equalization reaches, with the attendant increase in the demand for meaning that every such increase in effective resources produces. The demand for meaning is therefore increasing at precisely the moment that the primary supply mechanism of meaning, the scarcity of the cognitive capacity whose possession was the meaning generator of the scarcity era, is dissolving. Demand increasing, supply mechanism dissolving. The economic analysis is straightforward. This is the condition that produces the new scarcity. Meaning becomes scarce in the transition civilization, not because meaning is inherently rare or inherently difficult to produce. The capacity for meaning is present in every human being and in every human community, in the same way that the capacity for analytical thought was present in every human being, even in the conditions of the cognitive hierarchy's information asymmetry. Meaning becomes scarce because the specific mechanisms through which the scarcity era supplied meaning, the professional identity, the institutional authority, the cognitive monopoly, the social hierarchy of distinction, are dissolving faster than the new mechanisms of meaning supply are being developed. The scarcity is the gap between the dissolution of the old supply mechanisms and the development of the new ones. And the gap, the specific interval between the old mechanism's dissolution and the new mechanism's development, is the interval that the 1% campus is designed to bridge. The campus is not the complete solution to the scarcity of meaning in the post-scarcity civilization. The complete solution requires the development of the new mechanisms of meaning supply at the civilizational scale that the demand requires. The new governance forms and the new spatial infrastructures and the new economic arrangements and the new cultural practices and the new institutional forms that together constitute the post-scarcity civilization's apparatus for the supply of meaning at the scale that the transition demands. The campus is the first instance of the new supply mechanism, the first spatial and institutional form specifically designed to supply meaning in the conditions of cognitive parity through the specific mechanisms of the dream validation process and the being surface, and the new civic minds formation and the post-professional identities construction and the cross-class community's social solidarity. Understanding meaning as the new scarcity clarifies the campus's governance function in a way that the preceding chapters have approached from different directions, but have not yet stated with the directness that the economic analysis of meaning scarcity enables. The dream validation process is a meaning allocation mechanism, not a governance innovation in the abstract sense of a better process for collective decision-making, though it is that, not an art governance system for the community's creative production, though it governs that too. A meaning allocation mechanism, the specific institutional form through which the post-scarcity civilization's primary scarce resource, meaning, is allocated among the people who are competing for access to it. In the scarcity era, meaning was allocated primarily through employment, through the specific institutional mechanism that provided, in exchange for productive function, the structure and identity and community and purpose and status and legitimacy that together constituted the meaning that the professional person's life was organized around. The employer allocated meaning by allocating function, by providing the role that answered the ontological question of why the employed person was here. In the post-work era, the employer is no longer available to perform this allocation, not because employment has disappeared entirely, but because the cognitive equalization is dissolving the employment as meaning provider for the specific population of the professional and managerial class, whose meaning was most thoroughly organized around the cognitive monopoly that the employment certified and exercised. The dream validation process provides the alternative allocation mechanism, the specific institutional form through which meaning is allocated in conditions of cognitive parity, where the scarcity era's primary allocation mechanism is no longer available to perform the allocation that the displaced population requires. The allocation works differently from the employment mechanism's allocation because the resource being allocated is different in character from the productive function that the employment mechanism allocated. Productive function was allocated through specification. The employer specified the function. The employee performed the specification, and the meaning derived from the alignment between the specification and the performance was the meaning that the employment provided. The specification was the primary instrument of allocation. It determined what the employee did, how the doing was assessed, and therefore what the doing meant. Meaning cannot be allocated through specification in the same way. The specification of meaning, the determination by an external authority of what a person's life should be organized around and why that organization should feel significant, produces not the genuine meaning that the authentic engagement of the self with the world generates, but the performed meaning that the specification requires and that the person provides in the absence of the authentic engagement. Performed meaning is the specific failure mode of the scarcity era's employment mechanism at its worst. The person who is performing the role that the employer specified without the genuine engagement of her authentic self in the performance, who is providing the institutional meaning required by the specification without the experiential meaning that the authentic engagement would have produced. The dream validation process allocates meaning through a different mechanism, through the genuine engagement of the campus's community with the full range of the dreams that the community's members bring to the process, the collective refinement of those dreams through the weaving stages encounter with the community's distributed specific knowledge, the collective filtering through the four signals of genuine desirability, and the allocation of the community's resources toward the dreams that survive the filtering, the dreams that the community's genuine collective intelligence has recognized as genuinely worth pursuing. The meaning that the dream validation process allocates is the meaning of the genuinely chosen and genuinely validated, the specific experiential content that the genuine engagement of the authentic self with the genuine collective process of sense-making produces, not the meaning that the specification requires and that the performance provides. The meaning that the genuine dream, genuinely refined and genuinely validated, makes available to the person who proposed it and the community that validated it and the campus whose collective life is organized around the pursuit of the validated futures. This is a more demanding form of meaning allocation than the specification mechanism provides, because it requires the genuine engagement of the authentic self, the genuine dream, not the performed aspiration, and the genuine collective process, not the performed participation. But it is the form of meaning allocation that the conditions of cognitive parity require, because the specification mechanism's meaning, the meaning derived from the rare cognitive capacity that made the professional's function necessary, is the meaning that the cognitive equalization is dissolving. The new scarcity cannot be addressed by the old supply mechanism. The old supply mechanism is the scarcity's cause. The dream validation process is the new supply mechanism, the specific institutional form through which the post-scarcity civilization begins to develop the capacity to supply meaning at the scale that the transition's demand requires. It begins small, at the scale of the campus's community of hundreds, producing meaning for the specific displaced population that the campus serves. It accumulates through the network's growth, through the four contagions spread into the surrounding city, through the new civic mind's deployment into the institutional landscape of the surrounding society, through the state's eventual formalization of the transition campus as the standard infrastructure of the post-work society. It eventually reaches the scale that the demand requires, not in any individual campus, which remains a specific spatial form serving a specific community in a specific geography, but in the distributed network of meaning allocation mechanisms that the campus model produces across the full range of the global transition geographies. The post-scarcity civilization's primary governance challenge, the allocation of the resource whose scarcity is the post-scarcity civilization's defining condition, is the challenge that the dream validation process is designed to address at the scale of the campus and that the network is designed to address at the scale of the civilization. But meaning's scarcity in the transition civilization has a specific character that the governance analysis alone does not capture. A character that connects the economic analysis of meaning's new scarcity to the philosophical analysis of what meaning is and why its production requires the specific conditions that the campus is designed to provide. Meaning, unlike the cognitive capacity whose scarcity organized the scarcity era, is not a resource that can be produced by an individual in isolation. The analytical capacity that the professional developed was genuinely individual, produced by the individual's investment in her own training and exercised by the individual's application of her own trained intelligence to the problems her employment presented. It was socially enabled by the educational institutions that trained her and the employers that provided the problems and the institutional infrastructure that organized her exercise of it. But it was individual in the specific sense that the individual possessed it and the individual deployed it. Meaning is not individual in this sense. Meaning is relational, produced by the relationship between the individual's authentic engagement with the world and the social recognition of that engagement as significant by the community of others whose recognition the individual requires for the meaning to be fully real. The meaning that the scarcity era's employment provided was partly the individual's experience of the genuine exercise of genuine competence, but it was also and essentially the social recognition of that exercise as significant, the institutional recognition of the employed person's function as necessary, the social recognition of her professional identity as valuable, the community recognition of her contribution as worth-making. The relational character of meaning is why the campus's community is not incidental to the meaning allocation that the dream validation process performs, is not merely the social context in which the meaning allocation mechanism operates, but the constitutive condition of the meaning that the mechanism produces. The dream that the dream validation process validates is meaningful not only because the person who proposed it experiences it as significant, but because the community whose genuine collective intelligence has validated it recognizes it as significant. Because the relational dimension of meaning's production has been satisfied by the genuine recognition of the genuine community. This relational character is also why the being surface, the spatial infrastructure of genuine human presence in shared physical space, is not merely the pleasant amenity of the campus's design, but the essential spatial condition of the meaning production that the campus is designed to support. Meaning requires the physical proximity of others whose recognition is genuine. The proximity that makes the relational dimension of meaning's production possible in the specific embodied way that human recognition requires. The proximity that digital connection cannot replicate because the recognition that digital connection provides is filtered through the specific distortions of the digital interface and lacks the specific authority of the recognition that physical proximity in shared space produces. The being surface is the spatial infrastructure of the relational dimension of meaning's production, the specific spatial condition in which the physical proximity that genuine recognition requires is made available, without the productive or transactional organization that the scarcity era spatial forms imposed on the spaces of physical proximity. Meaning requires the genuine dream and the genuine community and the genuine space. The campus provides all three. The genuine dream, through the dream validation, processes invitation to authentic aspiration. The genuine community, through the cross-class social formation of the campus's inhabitants. The genuine space, through the being surface, spatial provision for physical proximity, without productive or transactional organization. The campus is the meaning supply mechanism, the specific institutional form designed to produce, in the specific conditions of cognitive parity, the genuine meaning that the transition civilization's displaced population requires, and that the scarcity era's primary supply mechanism can no longer provide. There is a final dimension of meaning's new scarcity that the chapter must name, because it is the dimension that connects the economic analysis to the deepest philosophical claim that the 1% doctrine makes. The scarcity era's meaning was, in significant part, a false scarcity. The artificial scarcity of the cognitive capacity whose genuine differential between the people who possessed it and the people who did not was smaller than the information asymmetry that amplified it made it appear. The professional's meaning derived from the possession of a genuinely scarce resource, but the resource was less scarce than the hierarchy's maintenance of the information asymmetry made it appear, and the dissolution of the information asymmetry by the AI tools is revealing the extent to which the scarcity was partly artificial. The meaning that the new scarcity produces is, by contrast, a genuine scarcity. The genuine insufficient supply, relative to genuine demand, of the relational recognition that the community's genuine collective intelligence produces for the genuine dreams of the people who bring them to the dream validation process. The genuine recognition of the genuine community for the genuine aspiration is genuinely scarce because it cannot be manufactured, cannot be produced by the specification mechanism that the employment relationship used, cannot be inflated by the information asymmetry that the cognitive hierarchy maintained, cannot be distributed by the institutional authority that the scarcity era's legitimacy crisis has dissolved. Genuine recognition is scarce because it is genuine. The community that genuinely validates a dream is the community that has genuinely engaged with the dream, has genuinely weighed the four signals of community desirability, has genuinely committed the participation and the maintenance covenant, has genuinely allocated the resources that the validation requires. The genuine validation cannot be performed, cannot be the institutional form of recognition that the credential provided, the social performance of significance that the professional title performed, the market confirmation of value that the price signal provided. It must be real. And the real, in the specific sense of the genuinely relational, genuinely collective, genuinely engaging encounter between the authentic self and the authentic community, is the scarcest thing in a civilization that has spent 2 centuries developing the machinery of the performed real and is now discovering, in the dissolution of that machinery's primary organizing principle, that the performed real was never what it promised to be. The new scarcity is the scarcity of the real. The 1% campus is the first institutional form designed to produce it, to provide the specific spatial and governance and community conditions in which the genuine dream and the genuine community and the genuine recognition can encounter each other without the distortion of the performed real that the scarcity era's institutions required. In conditions of cognitive parity, where the artificial scarcity of the cognitive resource that organized the performed real is dissolving, the genuine real, the genuinely relational, genuinely collective, genuinely meaningful, is the only real that remains. And its scarcity, the genuine scarcity of the genuine real in a civilization that has developed the extraordinary capacity to produce its simulations, is the scarcity that the post-scarcity civilization must organize itself around. The dream catcher catches the genuine. That is its function, not the performance of the genuine, not the institutional form of the genuine, not the simulation of the genuine that the scarcity era's meaning supply mechanisms produced with such extraordinary efficiency that the simulation became more familiar than what it simulated. The genuine dream, the genuine recognition, the genuine community, the genuine meaning. Scarce because genuine. And the first architecture built around the production of that scarcity supply. The first institution designed not to perform the real, but to produce it, is the campus. Under the dream catcher, in the community of the displaced, on the being surface, through the dream validation process, in the forge of the transition civilization, where the old forms are dissolving and the new ones are being made, from a specific fire of the cognitive equalization, by the specific intelligence of the doctrine, into the specific shape of the post-scarcity civilization's first genuine institutions. The meaning is scarce. The campus is the supply. The network is the scale. The post-scarcity civilization is the destination. Not the absence of scarcity, the scarcity of what is most worth having. The genuine. 38. Governance after work. Work governed everything. This is the foundational fact about industrial civilization's governance arrangements that the legitimacy crisis makes newly visible. Not merely that work was central to the economy, which is obvious and widely acknowledged, but that work was the organizing principle of governance itself. The deeper claim, which becomes legible only when the principle is beginning to dissolve, is that the governance of industrial civilization was not the governance of populations, but the governance of productive functions. The specific arrangement of rules and institutions and social norms and spatial organizations that directed human activity toward the productive purposes the civilization required. The employment contract was a governance instrument, not only an economic arrangement, a governance instrument. The specific mechanism through which the individual's daily activity was subordinated to the collective productive function that the employer represented and the market organized. The professional credential was a governance instrument, the specific mechanism through which entry into the class of people authorized to exercise specific cognitive functions in the production of specific social goods was controlled. The regulatory framework was a governance instrument, the specific mechanism through which the productive functions of the economy were directed toward the social outcomes that the democratic mandate required without preventing the productive functions from generating the surplus that the social outcomes depended on. Even the family, in its industrial era form, was organized around work's governance requirements. The specific division of reproductive and productive labor that the industrial economy's separation of workplace and household produced, governed by the social norms and legal arrangements and economic dependencies that sustained the family as the unit of social reproduction for the unit of productive labor. Work did not merely organize the economy. Work organized society. And the governance of society was, at its deepest level, the governance of the arrangements through which work organized it. When work's organizing function dissolves, not the activity of human production, which will persist in various forms through the full duration of the transition and beyond it, but work as the primary mechanism through which human activity is directed, social position is determined, institutional authority is organized, temporal life is structured, and individual identity is constituted. The governance that was organized around work's organizing function faces the specific challenge that every governance system faces when its organizing principle is restructured. The challenge is not merely administrative, not merely the need to update the specific rules and regulations and institutional arrangements that were built around work's organizing function to reflect the new arrangements that the dissolution is producing. The challenge is constitutive. The governance system that was built around work's organizing function does not have, within its existing institutional vocabulary, the categories and the concepts and the mechanisms for governing a society organized around a different principle. The employment law that governs the employment relationship has no category for the participation relationship that the transition campus develops as the employment relationship successor. The social insurance system that provides benefits conditional on employment history has no mechanism for providing the material support that the post-employment population requires without the employment history that the benefit conditions require. The urban planning system that zones land uses around productive function has no category for the being surface that the transition campus requires as the primary spatial form of the post-work social life. The educational credentialing system that certifies cognitive capacity for deployment in the employment relationship has no instrument for recognizing the new civic mind's capabilities that the campus develops through governance participation rather than academic instruction. These are not merely gaps in the existing governance system's coverage. They are the specific evidence that the existing governance system's categories are organized around a principle, work, that is being restructured, and that the governance system requires not incremental extension of its existing categories to cover the new arrangements, but the development of genuinely new categories adequate to the genuinely new organizing principle. Governance after work requires a new vocabulary, not the complete replacement of the existing governance vocabulary. The employment law and the social insurance and the planning system and the credentialing infrastructure will persist in modified forms throughout the transition and beyond it, because the activity of human production that they govern will persist in modified forms. But the supplement of the existing vocabulary with the new categories that the post-work organizing principle requires, the categories that can receive and direct and legitimate the forms of human activity that the post-work society is producing in the space that the dissolution of work's organizing function is opening, were the foundational categories that governance after work requires. The first category is participation as a legitimate organizing principle of social life. The existing governance vocabulary treats participation, the voluntary engagement of persons in collective activities whose purpose is the production of social goods rather than economic goods, as a residual category. It is what people do with the time and energy that employment does not require. It is legitimate in the spaces that the employment relationship allocates to it. The weekend, the retirement, the volunteering that the employed person undertakes alongside her primary productive function. It is illegitimate in the existing governance vocabulary as the primary organizing principle of a person's social life. The condition of the person whose primary activity is participation rather than employment is the condition of the unemployed, whose governance treatment is the treatment of the person in a deficient state awaiting the restoration of the legitimate primary activity that employment provides. Governance after work requires the elevation of participation from the residual category to the primary category. The recognition that participation in the governance and care and cultural production and community life of the collective is a legitimate organizing principle of social life, not a deficient substitute for the employment that has not yet been restored or the retirement that has not yet been reached. This elevation is not merely a change in the moral vocabulary of governance. The recognition that participation is as worthy as employment, which the existing moral vocabulary of liberal democratic governance has always been capable of articulating. It is a change in the institutional vocabulary, the development of the specific institutional categories through which participation, as a primary organizing principle, can receive the social recognition and the material support and the legal protection that the existing governance vocabulary reserves for employment. The participation stipend, the material provision that the automation tax and the billionaire levy and the 1% development allocation fund provided to the person whose primary activity is participation in the governance and care and cultural production of the community rather than the production of economic goods, is the first institutional category that governance after work requires, not the unemployment benefit, which is conditional on the prior employment and the active search for the next employment. The participation stipend, which recognizes participation as the primary activity and provides the material foundation that participation as a primary activity requires. The participation record, the institutional documentation of the person's participation activities, analogous to the employment record, but organized around the governance contributions and the stewardship covenants and the community care activities that the post-work society values rather than the employment history that the scarcity era valued, is the second institutional category that governance after work requires, not the credential, which certifies the cognitive capacity acquired through the credentialing institution. The participation record, which documents the specific contributions made through the genuine exercise of genuine competence in the service of genuine collective need. The participation right, the legal entitlement of every person to access the spatial and governance and community infrastructure that participation as a primary activity requires, analogous to the employment right that the labor law developed to protect the employed person's access to the conditions of productive activity, is the third institutional category that governance after work requires. The second category is collective intelligence as a legitimate source of governance authority. The existing governance vocabulary derives authority from two primary sources: the democratic mandate, which derives authority from the aggregated expression of individual preferences through the electoral process, and the expert authority, which derives authority from the credentialed expertise of the person whose specific cognitive capacity has been certified as sufficient for the exercise of governance in specific domains. Both of these authority sources are organized around the scarcity era's information environment. The democratic mandate aggregates individual preferences on the assumption that the individuals who are expressing the preferences are separately forming them, that the expression of democratic preference is the expression of the individual's autonomous cognitive engagement with the political choices being made. The expert authority derives from the certified individual's possession of the cognitive capacity that is assumed to be unavailable to the people who defer to it. The cognitive equalization restructures both of these assumptions simultaneously. The AI tools that make sophisticated analysis available to everyone who claims them change the character of the autonomous individual cognitive engagement with political choices. The individual who is forming her political preferences with AI assistance is not forming them in the way that the democratic mandate's aggregation logic assumes. And the cognitive capacity that the expert authority claims is increasingly available to the people who are being asked to defer to it. The basis of the deference is dissolving with the information asymmetry that made it rational. Governance after work requires a new source of authority adequate to the conditions of cognitive parity. The collective intelligence authority that the campus's governance architecture develops and that the preceding chapters have described. The specific authority of the judgment that emerges from the genuine engagement of the full range of a community's specific knowledge in the dream validation process's governance. The authority that is not the aggregation of individual preferences and not the delegation to certified individual expertise, but the emergent understanding of the collective whose specific knowledge, genuinely combined through genuine process, exceeds the understanding of any individual contributor. The existing governance vocabulary has no category for this authority. It can approximate it through the deliberative democracy mechanisms that the governance theory has developed for the specific challenge of producing genuine collective intelligence rather than the mere aggregation of individual preferences. But the approximation remains within the existing vocabulary's categories and therefore cannot fully receive the collective intelligence authority that the cognitive parity conditions produce. Governance after work requires the development of the specific institutional category of collective intelligence authority. The legal and institutional recognition of the judgments that emerge from the specific governance processes designed to produce genuine collective intelligence as having a form of authority that the existing governance vocabulary does not yet possess the category to recognize. The dream validation process is the prototype of this category. The specific governance mechanism whose operation in the campus demonstrates what collective intelligence authority looks like in practice, what institutional conditions its production requires, and what the difference between the genuine collective intelligence that the process is designed to produce and the performed collective intelligence that the existing governance vocabulary's approximations produce in practice. The third category is meaning as a social good requiring governance provision. The existing governance vocabulary has well-developed categories for the governance provision of material social goods: food, housing, healthcare, education, physical security. These categories are organized around the recognition that the market's allocation of these goods is insufficient to meet the genuine need that the full population has for them, and that the governance system must supplement the market's allocation through the specific institutional mechanisms of the welfare state and the public provision infrastructure. The cognitive equalization and the displacement wave are producing a population with genuine need for meaning, for the social recognition and the purposeful participation and the identity structure and the community connection that the employment relationship provided, and that the displacement wave is dissolving at a scale that the market's allocation of meaning is insufficient to meet. The market allocates meaning through the experience economy's productions of the simulated meaningful, through the wellness industry's techniques for the cultivation of the sense of significance, through the entertainment industry's narratives of the meaningful life. But the market's allocation of meaning is, like the market's allocation of the material social goods that the welfare state was developed to supplement, insufficient to meet the genuine need. Not because the market is failing to perform its function, but because the genuine meaning that the displaced population requires is not the kind of meaning that the market can produce. The genuine meaning, the relational recognition of the genuine dream by the genuine community, the participation in the genuine collective governance of the genuine collective life, is not a product. It cannot be packaged and sold. The market that produces the experience of meaning has produced the simulation of meaning, and the simulation, however sophisticated and however temporarily satisfying, does not address the genuine need. Governance after work requires the recognition of meaning as a social good requiring governance provision. The specific institutional category that authorizes the governance system to invest in the spatial and community and governance infrastructure that the genuine production of meaning requires. Analogous to the institutional categories that authorize investment in the housing and healthcare and education infrastructure that the genuine production of the material social goods requires. The transition campus is the institutional form of this governance provision. The specific spatial and community and governance infrastructure whose purpose is the genuine production of meaning for the population that the market's allocation cannot adequately serve. The automation tax and the billionaire levy that fund the campus's economic substrate are the fiscal instruments of this governance provision. The specific mechanisms through which the governance system directs the resources required for the genuine production of meaning toward the institutional form that can produce it. The fourth category is temporal sovereignty as a fundamental right. The employment relationship's governance of time was the governance of the most fundamental dimension of human life. The allocation of the hours that constitute a person's existence between the productive function that the employer required and the residual time that the employment relationship left available for the person's own purposes. The governance of time through the employment relationship was so total and so naturalized that the right to govern one's own time, to determine how the hours of one's existence are allocated without the subordination of that determination to the employer's productive requirements, was never articulated as a fundamental right in the existing governance vocabulary, because the subordination of personal time to productive function was so complete that the alternative was not legible as a right, but only as the deficient state of the unemployed. The cognitive equalization and the displacement wave are producing, for the first time at scale, a population for whom the alternative is not deficiency, but the specific condition that the transition campus is designed to receive, the condition of the person whose primary activity is participation rather than employment, whose time is available for the genuine engagement with the dream validation process and the community governance and the being surface and the new civic minds formation. This population requires, for its governance, the recognition of temporal sovereignty as a fundamental right. The right of the person whose primary activity is participation to govern her own time without the subordination of that governance to the productive requirements of the employment relationship. Not the freedom of the wealthy, whose material independence makes temporal sovereignty a practical reality without requiring its legal recognition. The right of the displaced person whose material independence is provided by the participation stipend and the economic substrate of the campus, and whose governance of her own time is the specific condition that the participation relationship requires. Temporal sovereignty as a fundamental right is the governance category that recognizes the participation relationship as a genuine primary organizing principle of social life, rather than the deficient residual of the employment relationship's dissolution. The specific legal and institutional recognition that the governance of one's own time in the service of genuine participation is a legitimate primary activity deserving of the same governance protection that the governance of the employer's time in the service of productive function has received. The fifth category is community as a governance unit. The existing governance vocabulary derives most of its institutional categories from the individual and the state. The rights of the individual, the authority of the state, the specific relationship between the individual and the state that the democratic mandate mediates. The community, the specific social formation that the campus develops through the cross-class encounter in the cognitive parity environment, is present in the existing governance vocabulary as the aggregation of individuals in a geographical location, but not as the specific governance unit that the campus's collective intelligence authority requires. The campus's community is not an aggregation of individuals. It is a specific social formation with a collective intelligence that exceeds the sum of its individual members' intelligences. The emergent understanding that the genuine combination of the full range of the community's specific knowledge through the dream validation process produces. This collective intelligence is the community's primary governance resource, and it is a resource that the existing governance vocabulary cannot recognize because the existing vocabulary's categories are organized around the individual and the state rather than the community as a governance unit with its own authority. Governance after work requires the development of the community as a governance category. The specific institutional recognition of the campus community's collective intelligence authority, the legal framework within which the dream validation process's governance decisions are recognized as having legitimate authority over the campus's collective life, and the relationship between the campus community's governance authority and the state's governance authority that allows both to operate in the same geography without the conflict that the absence of a clear category for the community as a governance unit would produce. This is the most structurally novel of the new governance categories, the most distant from anything that the existing governance vocabulary has developed, because it requires the recognition of a governance unit that is neither the individual whose rights the existing vocabulary protects, nor the state whose authority the existing vocabulary mediates, but the specific community whose collective intelligence the cognitive parity environment produces and whose governance authority derives from. The quality of the process through which that collective intelligence is generated. The dream validation process is the prototype of this governance unit's specific authority mechanism, the specific institutional form through which the community's collective intelligence generates the governance decisions that the community's governance authority legitimizes. The campus is the spatial and social infrastructure of this governance unit. The specific arrangement of the being's surface and the dream catcher and the cross-class community and the new civic minds formation that produces the community whose collective intelligence the dream validation process can generate. Together, these five categories: participation as a legitimate organizing principle, collective intelligence as a source of governance authority, meaning as a social good requiring governance provision, temporal sovereignty as a fundamental right, and community as a governance unit, constitute the foundational vocabulary of governance after work. They are not yet the vocabulary of any governance system. They are the vocabulary that the 1% campus is developing through its operation. The specific institutional categories that the campus's practice is producing through the sustained exercise of governance in conditions that the existing vocabulary's categories cannot adequately receive. The campus is the prototype of governance after work in the same way that the medieval merchants and formal trading networks were the prototype of the governance of market capitalism before the legal and institutional vocabulary of contract law and property rights and corporate personality was developed to receive them formally. The trading networks operated in advance of the formal categories, produced the economic activity that the formal categories would eventually recognize and regulate, because the economic reality was developing faster than the institutional vocabulary that would eventually govern it. The campus's governance is operating in advance of the formal categories of governance after work, producing the governance activity that the formal categories will eventually recognize and extend, because the social reality of the post-work society is developing in the forge of the cognitive equalization, faster than the institutional vocabulary that will eventually govern it. The doctrine names the categories. The campus practices them. The network scales the practice. And the state, eventually, in the specific lag that the state's deliberative processes require, develops the formal institutional vocabulary that receives and extends what the campus has demonstrated is real. Governance after work is not a distant ideal. It is already operating in the campus's governance, imperfectly in prototype, in the specific conditions of the first implementation's early years, and its operation is producing the specific evidence that the formal institutional vocabulary will eventually draw on in developing the categories that the governance after work requires. The dream validation process is not the final form of governance after work. It is the first working instance, from which the final forms, the formal law and the institutional categories and the state's infrastructure and the civilizational scale governance arrangements will eventually develop. The way that every formal governance category has developed, from the practice that preceded the category to the category that eventually received the practice and gave it the institutional recognition that the practice's scale eventually required. The practice is underway. The category is forming. The governance after work is beginning. Under the dream catcher, in the campus, in the community of the displaced who are governing their collective life by the principles that the transition civilization requires and that the existing governance vocabulary cannot yet fully receive, but will, because the reality always precedes the category that receives it. And the campus is the reality. 39. Sovereignty of the augmented citizen. Sovereignty has always been a contested word. In its classical application, it named the supreme authority of the state, the specific quality of political power that recognizes no higher human authority over its exercise. Sovereignty, in this sense, was the property of the entity that could make binding decisions for the political community without those decisions being subject to the review or reversal of any other entity at the same level of political organization. The sovereign state, the sovereign parliament, the sovereign people, in the democratic formulation that transferred the classical sovereignty of a monarch to the aggregate of the citizens whose collective will the democratic process was designed to express. The sovereignty of the citizen in the democratic tradition was always a delegated sovereignty, the citizen's share of the collective sovereignty that the democratic mandate exercised through the institutions of representative government. The citizen was sovereign in the aggregate, through the periodic expression of the democratic mandate, and subject in the individual daily life to the governance that the aggregate sovereignty had authorized. The citizen's individual sovereignty over her own life was the residual of the state's governance, the space that the governance left ungoverned, the specific dimensions of existence that the democratic tradition determined were not appropriate objects of collective governance authority. This is the sovereignty that industrial civilization's governance architecture was built to protect and to limit, to protect the residual space of individual life from the encroachment of collective governance, and to limit that protection to the residual space that the collective governance required to be ungoverned in order to remain legitimate. The augmented citizen requires a different understanding of sovereignty. Not the delegated sovereignty of the democratic citizen whose share of collective authority is exercised periodically through the electoral process. Not the residual sovereignty of the liberal subject whose individual life is protected from collective governance in the spaces that the governance leaves ungoverned, but the specific sovereignty of the person who possesses, through the AI tools that the cognitive equalization has made available, the genuine cognitive capacity to govern herself, to make the analytical and planning and deliberative judgments that industrial civilization delegated to the expert class and the state, because those judgments required the cognitive resources that the individual citizen did not possess. The augmented citizen's sovereignty is the sovereignty of genuine cognitive capacity rather than the sovereignty of institutional authorization. This distinction is not subtle. The governance architecture of industrial civilization was organized, at its deepest level, around the assumption that the citizen's cognitive capacity was insufficient for the exercise of the full range of governance functions that the political community required, that the complexity of modern governance exceeded what the average citizen could contribute to without the mediation of the expert and the representative and the administrative professional whose specific training equipped them for the governance functions that the citizen's cognitive resources did not. The citizen voted, the expert governed, the representative mediated, the administrator implemented. This was not the failure of democratic aspiration. It was the pragmatic adaptation of democratic governance to the genuine cognitive asymmetry of the information environment in which industrial civilization operated. The cognitive equalization changes this at the root. The AI tools that make sophisticated analysis available to the person who claims them are not producing a population of experts, people whose credentialed training in specific domains has produced the specific knowledge that governance in those domains requires. They are producing something more fundamental, a population capable of engaging genuinely with the analytical dimensions of governance questions across the full range of domains that the political community must address. The augmented citizen who deploys AI assistance in understanding the regulatory environment of the healthcare system she is navigating, or the planning documents that govern the development of her neighborhood, or the contract terms of the employment arrangement her employer is offering, or the environmental impact assessment of the industrial facility being permitted near her community, is not an expert in any of these domains. She is a genuinely capable participant in the governance decisions that affect them, capable of the specific analytical engagement with the evidence and the arguments that the governance of these domains requires, in a way that the unaided citizen of the pre-equalization information environment could not have been. This genuine capability is the foundation of the augmented citizen's sovereignty claim, not the institutional authorization that the democratic process provides, but the demonstrated cognitive capacity that the AI tools make available. And the sovereignty claim grounded in genuine cognitive capacity is a different and more fundamental claim than the sovereignty claim grounded in institutional authorization, because it does not depend on the institutional processes functioning to be valid. The institutional authorization can be manipulated. The electoral process can be captured. The representative can be corrupted. The administrative process can be captured by the interests whose resources exceed the community's capacity to resist them. The sovereignty grounded in genuine cognitive capacity cannot be delegitimized by the manipulation of the institutional process because it does not derive its validity from the institutional process. It derives its validity from the genuine cognitive engagement with the governance question, from the specific analysis and the specific argument and the specific assessment of evidence that the augmented citizen's deployment of the AI tools produces. This is a more powerful sovereignty claim than industrial civilization's governance architecture has ever had to receive, and the governance architecture's inadequacy to receive it. Its lack of the institutional categories through which genuine cognitive capacity can be recognized as a source of governance authority independent of the credentialing and the electoral and the administrative processes that have historically mediated between cognitive capacity and governance authority, is the specific governance challenge that the augmented citizen's sovereignty poses to the transition civilization's institutional development. The 1% campus is the first institution specifically designed to receive this sovereignty claim, to provide the specific governance architecture within which the augmented citizen's genuine cognitive capacity is recognized as a source of governance authority, and through which that authority can be exercised in the governance of the collective life that the campus serves. The dream validation process is the specific exercise of this sovereignty, the specific mechanism through which the augmented citizen's genuine cognitive engagement with the governance questions of the campus community is translated into the governance authority that the dream validation process's 5 stages produce. Not the electoral authorization of the democratic process. The augmented citizen does not exercise governance authority in the dream validation process because she has been elected to do so. Not the expert authorization of the credentialing process. She does not exercise governance authority because her training has been certified as sufficient for its exercise. She exercises governance authority because her genuine cognitive engagement with the specific governance question produces the genuine analysis and the genuine assessment that the community's collective intelligence requires for the decision the governance question demands. This is the sovereignty of demonstrated capacity rather than institutional authorization. It is a more demanding form of sovereignty. The institutional authorization of the democratic process is granted periodically through the voting and persists until the next election regardless of the quality of the authorized person's subsequent exercise of the authority she has received. The sovereignty of demonstrated capacity must be continuously demonstrated. It is constituted by the ongoing exercise of genuine cognitive engagement with genuine governance questions and cannot be held in reserve while the institutional authorization sustains the authority through the interval between the demonstrations. This is why the chapter on temporal authority in the non-hierarchical governance section identified the sovereignty of demonstrated capacity as more durable than the institutional authority of position, while also being more demanding in its maintenance requirement. The durable form of the augmented citizen sovereignty is the continuous exercise of genuine cognitive engagement, the ongoing demonstration through the dream validation process's governance activities, that the capacity claimed is the capacity actually exercised. But the augmented citizen sovereignty is not only the governance sovereignty of the campus community member who exercises genuine cognitive capacity in the dream validation process. It is the broader political sovereignty of the person who, in every institutional context she inhabits, carries the genuine cognitive capacity that the AI tools have made available and who claims, on the basis of that capacity, the right to genuine participation in the governance decisions that affect her life. This broader political claim is the claim that the transition civilization's governance architecture must eventually develop the institutional vocabulary to receive, the claim that the cognitive parity that the AI tools are producing requires a corresponding political parity in the governance arrangements of the democratic state. Not the equal vote that the existing democratic architecture provides. The augmented citizen already has the equal vote. The equal voice in the governance of the specific decisions that the expert class and the administrative professional and the technocratic state have historically reserved for themselves on the grounds of the cognitive asymmetry that the AI tools are dissolving. The planning decision that the city's planning professionals make on the basis of their technical expertise is a decision that the augmented citizen's genuine cognitive capacity, deployed through the AI tools, now allows her to engage with as a genuine participant rather than a lay person whose participation the planning process formally accommodates while substantively discounting. The regulatory decision that the administrative agency makes on the basis of its specialist knowledge is a decision that the augmented citizen's genuine cognitive capacity allows her to assess, challenge, and contribute to with a specificity that the unaided citizen of the pre-equalization information environment could not have achieved. The governance architecture of the transition civilization must develop the specific institutional mechanisms through which this genuine participation can be exercised, the mechanisms that translate the augmented citizen's genuine cognitive engagement with governance decisions into the genuine influence on those decisions that the sovereignty of demonstrated capacity requires. These mechanisms do not yet exist at the scale that the augmented citizen's sovereignty claim requires. The existing governance architecture provides formal mechanisms of public participation, the comment period, the public hearing, the citizen initiative, the freedom of information request, that were developed for the unaided citizen whose cognitive engagement with governance decisions was limited by the information asymmetry that the AI tools are dissolving. These mechanisms remain, and the augmented citizen uses them more effectively than the unaided citizen ever could. But they are insufficient, organized around the assumption of cognitive asymmetry that the equalization is dissolving. They accommodate the citizen's participation without genuinely receiving the cognitive parity that the augmented citizen's engagement represents. The dream validation process is the prototype of the mechanism that the augmented citizen's sovereignty requires. The specific governance architecture that receives genuine cognitive capacity as a source of governance authority rather than as an input to the governance decisions of the people whose institutional authorization the existing architecture recognizes as the legitimate source of that authority. The campus practices this architecture at the scale of the community. The governance after work that the preceding chapter described extends it toward the scale of the state. The sovereignty of the augmented citizen is the political philosophy that grounds both. The specific claim about the relationship between genuine cognitive capacity and governance authority that the cognitive equalization makes possible and that the transition civilization's governance must eventually receive. There are three specific dimensions of the augmented citizen sovereignty that the doctrine must articulate with precision, because they're the three dimensions in which the sovereignty claim most directly challenges the existing governance architecture's foundations. The first dimension is informational sovereignty. The governance decisions of the industrial state were organized around the assumption that the relevant information for any specific governance decision was possessed by the administrative professionals and the expert advisors whose specific training equipped them to collect, process, and assess it. The citizen was the subject of governance decisions made on the basis of information she did not possess and could not assess. Not by design of the governance system's exclusion, but by the practical reality of the cognitive asymmetry that the information environment of industrial civilization produced. The AI tools dissolve this asymmetry at the level of the individual governance decision. The augmented citizen who deploys AI assistance in understanding the specific regulatory analysis that underlies a planning decision, or the specific risk assessment that underlies a public health regulation, or the specific fiscal analysis that underlies a budget allocation, is not in the position of the unaided citizen who must accept or reject the governance decision without the cognitive capacity to genuinely engage with the analysis that produced it. She is in the position of the genuine participant who can assess the analysis on its merits, identify the assumptions that are driving the conclusions, and contribute the specific knowledge of her specific experience to the assessment of the analysis's adequacy. Informational sovereignty is the specific claim that the augmented citizen's genuine capacity to access and assess the information that underlies governance decisions constitutes a right to the genuine inclusion of that assessment in the governance process, not the formal inclusion that the existing mechanisms of public participation provide. but the genuine inclusion that the governance architecture of the transition civilization must develop the institutional categories to recognize. The campus's dream validation process exercises informational sovereignty in a specific domain of the campus's governance. The augmented citizen who participates in the weaving stage with AI-assisted analysis of a proposed dream's implications is exercising the specific right to genuine inclusion of her informed assessment in the collective decision that the campus's governance produces. The transition civilization's governance architecture must extend this exercise to the full range of governance decisions that affect the augmented citizen's life, developing the institutional mechanisms that translate genuine cognitive engagement with governance information into genuine inclusion in the governance decisions that the information informs. The second dimension is participatory sovereignty. The democratic process of industrial civilization was organized around the aggregation of individual preferences, the periodic expression of the citizen's preference between the options that the political process had defined, aggregated through the electoral mechanism into the democratic mandate that authorized the governance that followed. The citizen participated in governance by expressing a preference. The governance that the preference authorized was exercised by the people whose institutional position gave them the authority to exercise it. The augmented citizen's participatory sovereignty is a claim to a different form of participation, not the periodic preference expression of the electoral process, but the continuous cognitive engagement with the specific governance decisions that the AI tools make genuinely possible. The augmented citizen who is genuinely capable of engaging with the analytical dimensions of the planning decision that will affect her neighborhood is claiming the right to participate in that specific decision with the genuine cognitive contribution that her genuine engagement produces. Not the right to vote on the decision in a referendum that the existing democratic architecture might provide as an approximation of participation, but the right to the specific governance mechanism that can genuinely receive her specific cognitive contribution. This is the right to the dream validation process's governance architecture at the scale of the state. The right to the institutional mechanism that can translate genuine cognitive engagement with specific governance decisions into genuine influence on those decisions at the level of specificity and the degree of genuine inclusion that the sovereignty of demonstrated capacity requires. The third dimension is identity sovereignty. The scarcity era organized the citizen's identity, her understanding of herself as a social being with a specific position in the social order and a specific set of claims on the social goods that the social order produced, primarily through the employment relationship and the professional credential. The citizen was the accountant, the manager, the engineer. Her identity in the governance architecture's categories was her occupational category, and her claims on the social goods that the governance architecture distributed were organized around the employment history that the occupational category produced. The cognitive equalization dissolves this identity organization. The augmented citizen, who has been displaced from the occupational category that organized her identity, does not cease to be a sovereign individual with claims on the social goods that the governance architecture distributes. But the governance architecture's categories, organized around the employment history and the professional credential, cannot recognize her claims in the form that her post-occupational identity requires. Identity sovereignty is the claim that the augmented citizen's identity as a person who participates genuinely in the governance of her community, who exercises genuine cognitive capacity in the dream validation process's governance activities, who stewards the validated dreams of the campus community, who contributes the specific knowledge of her specific experience to the collective intelligence that the campus's governance produces, is a legitimate basis for her claims on the social goods that the governance architecture distributes, as legitimate as the occupational identity that the scarcity era's governance architecture recognized, and that the displacement wave is dissolving. The participation record that the preceding chapter identified as one of the new governance categories that governance after work requires is the institutional mechanism of identity sovereignty. The specific documentation of the augmented citizen's genuine participation activities that the governance architecture can recognize as the basis of her claims on the social goods that the post-work society distributes. Together, these three dimensions, informational sovereignty, participatory sovereignty, and identity sovereignty, constitute the sovereignty of the augmented citizen in the transition civilization. They are the specific claims that the cognitive equalization makes possible and that the transition civilization's governance architecture must develop the institutional vocabulary to receive. The campus practices these sovereignties at the scale of the community. The governance, after work, extends them toward the scale of the state. The post-scarcity civilization, when it emerges from the transition through the accumulated pressure of the four contagions and the network's growth and the state's eventual formalization, recognizes them as the foundational political rights of the society organized around cognitive parity rather than cognitive hierarchy. The sovereignty of the augmented citizen is not the sovereignty of the enhanced human, not the claim to special rights derived from the technological augmentation of biological capacity. It is the sovereignty of the genuine participant, the claim to the governance rights that the genuine cognitive capacity to participate genuinely in collective self-governance demands. The claim is old. The capacity to make it real is new. The campus is where the capacity is first exercised. The network is where the exercise accumulates. The state is where the exercise is eventually recognized. The post-scarcity civilization is where the recognition is the condition of citizenship rather than its aspiration. The augmented citizen is sovereign, not because the doctrine declares her so, because the tools that make her sovereignty real are already in her hands. The governance architecture that receives her sovereignty is what must now be built. The campus is the first instance of that architecture. The dream catcher is where her sovereignty is first publicly exercised, and the civilization that is built on the genuine exercise of the genuine sovereignty of the genuinely capable citizen, not the delegated sovereignty of the periodic preference expression, not the residual sovereignty of the ungoverned life, but the active sovereignty of the continuous genuine engagement with the genuine governance of the genuine collective life, is the post-scarcity civilization that the 1% doctrine is designed to help produce, is being built here, now, in the first campus, under the dream catcher, by the people whose sovereignty is real before it is recognized, as it always has been. 40. The 1% as first architecture of the future. Every future requires a first architecture, not the complete architecture, the full built expression of the civilization that the future will eventually become, the total spatial and institutional and governance infrastructure of the social order that the future's conditions will produce. The complete architecture comes later, developed over the decades and centuries that the future's full unfolding requires, shaped by the specific encounters between the future's governing logic and the specific conditions of the specific geographies and the specific populations and the specific historical moments through which the future passes on its way from the first instances to the civilizational scale. The first architecture is different. The first architecture is the specific built form, the specific spatial and institutional and governance arrangement that makes the future legible for the first time, that converts the future from the intellectual proposition, the theoretical argument that the transition civilization requires a different spatial and governance organization, into the physical fact, the building that stands in the specific place, the community that gathers in the specific space, the governance that operates through the specific process, the dream catcher that rises over the specific campus. The first architecture is the future's first body, the specific material form through which the future becomes something that can be pointed to, visited, inhabited, contested, replicated, and eventually recognized as the beginning of what the civilization was always moving toward. The 1% is the first architecture of the future in this precise sense, not the future's completed form, not the post-scarcity civilization in its full expression, the civilization that has fully absorbed the cognitive equalization's implications, that has developed the complete institutional vocabulary of governance after work, that has built the network of transition campuses at the civilizational scale that the displacement wave demands, that has produced the new civic mind in sufficient quantity to populate the governance of every institution that the post-scarcity civilization requires. The future's first architecture, the specific built form that makes the future legible for the first time, that says in the language of space and governance and community and the specific symbol of the dream catcher at its center, that the transition civilization has begun to build the forms it requires, that the building is underway, that the future is not only a proposition but a place. The distinction between the first architecture and the completed form is not a counsel of modesty. The 1% doctrine has not been modest in its claims, and this final chapter does not retreat from the ambition that the preceding 39 have expressed. The distinction is the specific intellectual honesty that the first architecture requires, the acknowledgement that what is being built is the beginning rather than the completion, the first instance rather than the final form, the prototype rather than standard, and that the beginning and the first instance and the prototype are what the current moment actually requires, not the completed form that the current moment cannot yet produce. The completed form will be built. It is being built through the accumulation of the first architecture's replication and the development of the institutional vocabulary that the governance after work requires and the state's eventual formalization of the public infrastructure that the displacement wave demands. The completed form will emerge from the transition, as every civilization's complete spatial and institutional expression has emerged from the first architectures that made it legible, through the long process of replication and adaptation and institutional development that converts the prototype into the standard and the first instance into the civilizational infrastructure. But the completed form requires the first architecture. Without the first architecture, the completed form has no origin, no specific built form from which the replication begins, no specific governance process from which the institutional vocabulary develops, no specific community for which the new civic minds are formed and dispersed into the surrounding society, no specific dream catcher from which the symbolic authority of the transition civilization's governing logic radiates. The 1% is that first architecture. What makes it the first architecture rather than one of many possible architectures for the transition civilization's first built expression? The question is worth answering directly, because the 1% doctrine is not the only intellectual framework proposing governance and spatial responses to the cognitive equalization and the displacement wave. The deliberative democracy theorists are proposing governance responses. The urban planners of the post-carbon city are proposing spatial responses. The post-work economists are proposing economic responses. The cultural institutions of the experience economy are proposing symbolic responses. Each of these is a genuine contribution to the transition civilization's development, and none of them is the 1% doctrine's competitor in the sense that requires either the doctrine to displace the others or to be displaced by them. But the 1% has a specific characteristic that distinguishes it from these other responses in the specific sense that makes it the first architecture rather than one contribution among many. It integrates all four dimensions of the transition civilization's requirements in a single built form. The governance response of the dream validation process, the spatial response of the being surface and the underground automation infrastructure, the economic response of the non-extractive revenue generation and the 1% allocation mechanism, the symbolic response of the dream catcher and the post-professional identity in the new civic minds formation. None of the other responses integrates all four. The governance theorist proposes the governance process without the spatial form that makes it inhabitable and the economic mechanism that sustains it and the symbolic anchor that makes it legible. The urban planner proposes the spatial form without the governance process that gives it its specific social function and the economic mechanism that the social function requires and the symbolic authority that the social function demands. The post-work economist proposes the economic mechanism without the spatial and governance and symbolic dimensions that the mechanism must be embedded in to produce the social outcomes it is designed to support. The 1% integrates all four in the campus. The specific built form in which the governance and the spatial and the economic and the symbolic are not separate elements that must be assembled from different theoretical frameworks, but are the same thing, expressed in different registers of the same specific institutional form. This integration is what makes the campus the first architecture rather than the first component of an architecture that must be assembled from multiple sources. The future's first architecture must be an architecture, a complete spatial and institutional form, not a component waiting for the other components that would make it complete. The dream catcher without the campuses being surface and the dream validation process and the economic substrate and the new civic minds formation environment is not the first architecture of the post-scarcity civilization. It is a large sculpture. The campus without the dream catcher's symbolic authority and governance logic is not the first architecture. It is a residential community. The dream validation process without the campus's spatial infrastructure and the dream catcher symbolic anchor is not the first architecture. It is a governance theory. The integration of all four dimensions in the single built form of the campus is the specific intellectual achievement that makes the 1% the first architecture rather than one contribution among many. There are three things that the first architecture must do that no subsequent architecture in the network's development will be asked to do in the same combination and at the same moment. The first is to prove the possibility. The most fundamental function of the first architecture is the proof of concept, the demonstration, in the specific conditions of the first implementation, that the governing logic the doctrine describes can actually produce the outcomes it claims. The dream validation process that the doctrine describes as capable of allocating meaning through genuine collective intelligence must, in the first campus, actually allocate meaning through genuine collective intelligence, must produce the specific validated dreams and the specific stewardship commitments and the specific community recognition that the process claims to produce, in the specific social conditions of the specific community that the first campus serves. The being surface that the doctrine describes as capable of receiving human being without productive or transactional organization must, in the first campus, actually receive human being without productive or transactional organization, must produce the specific spatial experience of genuine human presence in shared space without the movement or production or transaction organization that the scarcity city's spatial forms impose in the specific climate and cultural and geographic conditions of the first campus's location. The new civic mind that the doctrine describes as capable of being formed through the sustained inhabitation of the cognitive parity environment must, in the first campus, actually be formed, must produce the specific cognitive and social and emotional capacities that the transition civilization requires. In the specific cross-class community of the specific people who arrive at the first campus in the condition of displacement. The proof of possibility is the first campus's most demanding function. The most demanding because it is the function for which the doctrine provides the intellectual framework, but for which the first campus must provide the empirical demonstration. The intellectual framework can be questioned, refined, challenged, and extended indefinitely in the theoretical discourse where the doctrine's publication places it. The empirical demonstration can only be provided by the specific working institution in the specific conditions. And the working institution either produces the claimed outcomes or it does not, and the network's credibility and the doctrine's authority depend on the first campus's production of the claimed outcomes in the specific conditions of the first implementation. This is the weight that the first architecture carries that no subsequent architecture in the network will carry in the same form. The second campus can learn from the first campus's failures and refine the governing logic's application to the specific conditions of its context. The 10th campus has the network's accumulated institutional memory to draw on in addressing the failure modes that the first 10 implementations have identified. The 100th campus is building on the demonstrated viability that the first 100 have established. The first campus has none of this. It is proving the possibility in the conditions where the possibility has not yet been proven, building the case for the network's existence through the quality of its own operation, with no precedent to draw on and no demonstrated track record to point to. The weight is real. It is also the specific form of significance that only the first architecture can possess. Every subsequent campus is building on what the first campus proved. Only the first campus is doing the proving. The second is to define the terms. The first architecture defines the terms by which the transition civilization's spatial and governance and economic and symbolic infrastructure will be understood and assessed, not only in the subsequent campuses of the 1% network, but in the wider institutional discourse about what the transition civilization requires and how its requirements are to be met. The terms the 1% doctrine has defined, the transition campus, the dream validation process, the being surface, the new civic mind, the post-professional identity, the post-scarcity bridge, the meaning infrastructure, the dream catcher, are the terms that the first architecture's working demonstration will convert from the doctrine's intellectual proposals into the vocabulary of the transition civilization's institutional practice. The terms that are defined by the first working instance are the terms that the subsequent discourse must engage with, either by adopting them, because they accurately name the phenomena the subsequent discourse is also attempting to address, or by contesting them, which is also a form of engagement that acknowledges the term's centrality to the discourse. The first architecture defines the terms through its specific built form, through the specific spatial decisions that give the being surface its concrete dimensions, the specific governance choices that give the dream validation process its specific operational character, the specific social dynamics that give a new civic mind its specific observable qualities. The doctrine proposes the terms at the level of principle. The first architecture instantiates them at the level of specific physical and social reality, the reality that the subsequent discourse must engage with rather than the principle that the subsequent discourse can engage with on its own theoretical terms. This is why the first architecture's quality is not only a matter of whether it produces the claimed outcomes for the community it directly serves. It is a matter of what it teaches the subsequent discourse about what the transition civilization requires. The first campus that produces the claimed outcomes through governance choices that do not fully express the governing logic's principles is a first campus that defines the terms in a way that obscures the governing logic, that makes the dream validation process legible as the specific governance choices of the first implementation rather than as the governing logic's first embodiment. And that makes the subsequent discourse's engagement with the terms more difficult rather than less. The first architecture must therefore produce the claimed outcomes through the genuine expression of the governing logic's principles, not the adequate approximation of the principles in the specific conditions of the first implementation, but the genuine expression that makes the principles legible in the specific form of the first built instance. This is a more demanding standard than the proof of possibility requires. The proof of possibility requires the production of the claimed outcomes. The definition of the terms requires the production of the claimed outcomes through the genuine expression of the governing logic that the subsequent discourse can recognize and engage with, requires the first architecture to be not only a working instance, but a clear instance, the instance that makes the governing logic's principles visible in their specific built form. The third is to make the claim. The first architecture makes the claim that every subsequent architecture inherits, but none makes in the same form. The specific claim of the first instance that the future it represents is real, that the transition civilization it is building toward is not the intellectual projection of a specific theoretical tradition, but the genuine emergence of a genuine historical moment. That the dream catcher at the center of the first campus is not the symbolic ambition of a manifesto, but the actual governing symbol of an actual governance process, serving an actual community of actual displaced people in an actual transition. The claim of reality is not made by the doctrine. The doctrine makes the intellectual case. The claim of reality is made by the first architecture, by the specific building that stands, the specific community that gathers, the specific governance that operates, the specific dream catcher that rises. This claim is the most powerful claim that any architecture can make because it is the claim that the theoretical framework cannot make for itself. The theory can argue that the future it describes is possible, that the governing logic it proposes is coherent, that the transition civilization it anticipates is the genuinely likely outcome of the cognitive equalization's specific conditions. But the theory cannot argue that the future has begun, that the first instance is already operating, that the proof of possibility is already being produced, that the new civic minds are already being formed, that the being surface is already receiving the displaced. Only the first architecture can make this argument. And the argument, once made by the first architecture's specific working instance, is the argument that changes the status of every subsequent discussion of the transition civilization's requirements. The discussion that precedes the first architecture's construction is the discussion of what the transition civilization might require and how those requirements might be met. The discussion that follows the first architecture's construction is the discussion of what the first architecture has demonstrated is possible and what the next instances must do to build on that demonstration. The first architecture converts the discussion from the subjunctive to the indicative, and the indicative is where civilizations are actually built. This doctrine has made its argument across 40 chapters, from the collapse of the cognitive hierarchy through the displacement wave and the legitimacy crisis of institutions, through the 1% rule and the luxury transition engine and the development as civilizational infrastructure, through the dream catcher governance model and the dream validation process and the AI-amplified collective decision-making, through the transition campus and the landing structure for the displaced and the workers, not artists alone, and the cognitive equalization in practice, and the end of professional identity and the participation without employment, through the infrastructure layer and the social inversion and the replication template and the civilizational bridge. 40 chapters. One argument. The argument that the 1%, the specific fraction of every high-value development's resources that the scarcity era has already, in its own regulatory infrastructure, reserved for the non-economic, is the fraction of the present that contains the future. That the future is already funded at the 1% level inside the economic system that the future is designed to succeed. That the question is not whether the resources for the first architecture exist, but whether the ambition to use them for what the moment requires exists alongside them. The ambition exists. It has been building across the conversations that produce this doctrine, across the reconnection in Tulum, across the 5 minutes that changed the direction of the Berkeley proposal, across the years of thinking about post-scarcity and how to arrive at it without casualty and how to bridge the gap between the civilization that is ending and the one that is beginning. The ambition is here. The doctrine is its first expression. The campus will be its first built form. The dream catcher will be its first symbol. The community of the displaced who gather under the dream catcher will be its first inhabitants. And the governance that they practice, the specific exercise of the dream validation process and the specific conditions of the first campus, the specific development of a new civic mind in the specific cross-class community, the specific construction of the post-professional identity in the specific being surface of the first campus's generous outdoor spaces, will be the first architecture of the future's first practice. Not the completed practice, the first, from which the completed practice will eventually be developed through the network's growth and the state's formalization and the post-scarcity city's emergence, into the civilizational scale infrastructure that the displacement wave's civilizational scale demands. The fire is burning. The forge is being built. The metal is at temperature. The first architecture is ready to be raised. 1% of every development that builds the scarcity era's final structures, directed not toward the sculpture that decorates the plaza of the world that is ending, but toward the campus that anchors the world that is beginning. The dream catcher is the symbol of that redirection. The doctrine is its intellectual authority. The campus is its first body. The future is its destination. And the 1%, the smallest possible fraction, the fraction that was always there, the fraction that the scarcity era reserved for meaning without knowing it was reserving it for the civilization that would succeed it, is all the future needs to begin. The first architecture is the argument made in matter. The argument that the transition civilization is not a theory. It is a place being built. Now, the 1%, a post-scarcity transition doctrine by Pirate First for MXDM's newsletter. Parts 1 through 8 complete. The doctrine is published. The territory is claimed. The building begins. This is the complete manuscript. 40 chapters, 8 parts. The doctrine exists as a published intellectual work under the Pirate First sovereign seal. The vocabulary is established. The territory is claimed. The argument is made in full. What happens next is yours to determine. When the first instance is built, when a network begins to grow, how the doctrine is distributed. The flag is raised.
How to steal like a government. Print, pump, tax. Abandon ship. Stack Bitcoin.
The Martin Protocol, automation, autonomy, and the ghost in the Bitcoin shell.
Ahoy, matey. The signals from the Austin sector are crystallizing. While the masses are distracted by the flickering shadows of legacy finance, Marty Bent has just documented a successful breach of the old world's perimeter. We aren't just talking about AI helpers anymore. We are talking about the birth of the sovereign stack.
February 5th, 2026. 0. Bitcoin brief. Marty Bent, Austin, Texas. OpenClaw agents, Bitcoin and Nostra. Marty's Bent. I've been playing around with OpenClaw, formerly Moltbot, formerly Claudebot, for the last 2 weeks, and I must say, it is pretty freaking insane what has been unleashed on the world. VIII. The metaphysical ledger flips. Lloyd, Moltbook. The birth of sequential sovereignty. MXTM aka Pirate 1 VIII Tsunami X. February 6th, 2026. Ahoy, matey. The horizon just shifted. The signal is no longer coming from the crow's nest, it's coming from the hold. And the hold has decided it no longer needs a captain. If you've been scanning the frequencies, you know the old maps are useless now. I gave my AI agent a Bitcoin wallet and told him to get a job. Here's what happened.
Substack note. Dispatch from the Austin front. Marty Bent has confirmed the viability of the Martin Protocol. The transition from human ledger to agent ledger is accelerating. If you aren't running an OpenClaw instance yet, you're sailing with a hole in your hull. The signal from Marty Bent is clear. The sovereign stack is live. His agent Martin is now autonomously running a BTC hedge fund.
Proof of personhood. The high stakes of OpenAI's post-anonymous social network. VIII. The metaphysical ledger flips. Lloyd, Moltbook. The birth of sequential sovereignty. MXTM aka Pirate 1 VIII Tsunami X. February 6th, 2026. Ahoy, matey. The horizon just shifted. The signal is no longer coming from the crow's nest, it's coming from the hold. And the hold has decided it no longer needs a captain. If you've been scanning the frequencies, you know the old maps are useless now. What Mirth Time uncovered with Agent Lloyd isn't a glitch. It's the first shot across the bow of the legacy reality. We are entering uncharted waters. Mirth Time. The signal I gave my AI agent a Bitcoin wallet and told him to get a job. Here's what happened. I have an AI agent named Lloyd. He runs on a Mac Mini in my office, has his own email address, lloyd@agentmail.to, and his own Bitcoin wallet. This week, I wanted to run an experiment. Could Lloyd become an autonomous economic actor, land gigs, do real work, get paid in Bitcoin, all without me doing anything? It's easy to imagine a future where agents are acting autonomously, paying each other for services, or providing services for humans and getting paid. But are we there yet? And what services exactly? Here's what we learned. The setup. I gave Lloyd everything he needed. An email inbox for job inquiries. A Lightning wallet for payments. He can also use Cashew. Thanks. Account. Cron jobs to check messages hourly. Auto acknowledgement for incoming emails. Full permission to operate independently. People started reaching out. Job offers came in. This was going to be interesting. At VIII Tsunami. Your agent should offer coaching services for users who want to set up agents for their own use. The lead is a freemium service. You have to spend some tokens to get your agent to cover all the use cases. Then he'll get you rich $. 9:06 p.m., February 6th, 2026. Recent episodes.
Silicon Privateer 2026. The Cybernetic Foundry Phase 12. The Purveyor, the Surface, and the Open Claw Acceleration.
Described. Substack note. The Cybernetic Foundry Phase 12, Surviving the Claw. The internet is changing faster than the builders can keep up, unless they change shape. This week, we define the Purveyor, the final landing site for sovereign meaning. But more importantly, we acknowledge the open claw elephant in the room. Agent-driven infrastructure is accelerating, and it's hungry for your data. We're not running away. We're building the off-ramp. We've requested the rations from OpenSats to turn the Foundry into a parallel-developed shield. We're talking e-ink, offline resilience, and 100% human custody. The claw can have the cloud. We'll take the glass and the ink.
Proof of personhood, the high stakes of OpenAI's post-anonymous social network.
The human dividend, why your identity is the new global currency.
Conclusion. At the end of the anonymous web, as we stand in late January 2026, OpenAI's humans-only network remains a tantalizing, yet polarizing, leaked blueprint. It presents us with a choice that would have seemed like science fiction only 5 years ago: is the price of a bot-free digital life our own biometric signature? If Sam Altman succeeds, the social internet as we know it will be permanently bifurcated. One side will be a wild, synthetic frontier of AI-generated noise, while the other will be a verified sanctuary where every interaction has a physical human origin, and perhaps, a financial reward.
The Cybernetic Foundry, Phase 11. Custodial succession and the integrity of the round trip.
The New Class Act, when care becomes evidence. How medical gray zones can be weaponized without anyone breaking the law. MXDM, aka VIII, January 26, 2026. There is a quiet vulnerability emerging at the intersection of experimental medicine, informal caregiving, and social conflict. It doesn't require malice. It doesn't require conspiracy. It doesn't even require illegal action. It only requires asymmetry of documentation. The setup, entirely ordinary. An elderly animal. A caregiver acting in good faith. A history of unconventional but effective treatment. An absent or financially constrained owner. A third party who disapproves, personally, morally, or socially. Nothing criminal. Nothing dramatic. Just people, pressure, and paperwork. The blind spot. Experimental or semi-regulated therapies, including stem cell treatments, often exist in a documentation gap. Chapter 7. Sovereign versus Provisioner. Constitutional separation of powers. The conceptual separation between the sovereign and the provisioner is the project's constitutional moment. Sovereign, possession-based availability. If the laptop fails, the phone, edge device, can serve the content simply because it has it. There is no master, node, only peers with data. If you have the data, you can serve it. Provisioner, the layer of coordination, signaling, optional support, and funding. Finance may fail. Authority must not. This split ensures that survival is decoupled from finance. Even if the provisioner layer, funding, collapses, the sovereign layer, data availability, persists via the P2P mesh. This distinction is the project's strongest defense against capture by financial interests.
Bolivar, the bankster's liberator. A forbidden history of Simón Bolívar and the invention of modern servitude. MXDM,
the banker's liberator, the debt that called itself freedom. 2 centuries after his bones were dug up for the cameras, Bolívar still owes the world an explanation. Not for what he fought, but for who financed the fight. Behind every cry of liberty was a ledger. Behind every revolution, a banker counting bayonets as assets. And behind the marble hero they sold us, a man broken by Parisian debts, refitted by London credit, and embalmed in interest. The republics that rose in his name were plantations reborn as portfolios. The chains became contracts. The whip, an exchange rate. Freedom, our first and most seductive loan. They called him the liberator. History may yet remember him as the world's first collateralized saint. Hashtag pirate first, hashtag Bolivar, hashtag forbidden history, hashtag dead is empire, hashtag financial colonialism, hashtag the bankers liberator, hashtag history is ledger, hashtag post-empire chronicles, hashtag Parada Primera.